Most people think they're bad with money. They think they don't budget well enough. They think they spend too much. They think they made the wrong career choices, took the wrong risks, or didn't work hard enough early on. And for years, that belief feels reasonable. Because no one ever tells you the alternative. No one tells you that the problem might not be your behavior. No one tells you that the math itself may be stacked against you. No one tells you that feeling behind doesn't automatically mean you failed. So people carry the guilt quietly. They blame themselves. They replay old decisions in their head and wonder what they should have done differently. They assume that if they were smarter, more disciplined, or more motivated, their finances would finally make sense. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people are never taught to consider. For millions of workers, the issue isn't spending. It isn't discipline. It isn't mindset. It's pay. Not just low pay in the obvious sense, but wages that were never designed to keep up with the real cost of living in the first place. This video isn't about telling you that nothing is your responsibility, and it's not about pretending personal choices don't matter. They do. But responsibility only matters if the system gives you a fair starting point. And for a growing number of people, it doesn't. From the outside, everything looks fine. Employment numbers, economic growth, corporate profits, productivity charts. The system constantly tells you the economy is strong, that opportunity is everywhere, and that if you're struggling, it must be something personal. But the lived experience tells a different story. People are working more hours than ever. They're more productive than previous generations. They're more educated, more connected, more efficient. And yet financial stability feels further away, not closer. That disconnect is where the self-blame starts. When effort goes up but outcomes don't improve, people assume they're doing something wrong. They don't immediately assume the system is underpaying them, because they were taught not to. From a young age, most people are conditioned to believe that wages are a fair reflection of value, that the market rewards skills, that pay increases naturally over time, that loyalty, hard work, and experience eventually lead to security. But that story stopped matching reality a long time ago. For decades, productivity has continued to rise while wages flattened. Workers learned how to do more with less. Technology made them faster, cheaper, and easier to replace. Companies became leaner, profits grew, executive compensation exploded, paychecks didn't. That gap didn't happen by accident. And it didn't happen because workers suddenly became less valuable. It happened because the system discovered something important. You can underpay people quietly if you convince them it's normal. Instead of saying, "We're paying you less than your work is worth," the system reframed the conversation. It talked about competition, about globalization, about efficiency, about market forces, about personal responsibility. And most people accepted it because the alternative was unsettling. If wages are low by design, then struggling isn't a personal failure. It's a predictable outcome. That idea is dangerous to a system that depends on compliance, so instead, people are told to optimize. Budget harder, hustle more, stack side incomes, monetize hobbies, turn rest into productivity, turn identity into income. When that doesn't work, the blame goes inward. You feel irresponsible for wanting stability. You feel unrealistic for expecting progress. You feel ashamed for not figuring it out by now. But look at the numbers honestly. Housing costs didn't rise because everyone suddenly wanted bigger homes. Healthcare didn't become expensive because people got worse at planning. Education didn't explode in price because students stopped being disciplined. Those costs rose because the system shifted them downward, while wages failed to follow. And when wages don't keep up, every other decision becomes harder. Saving feels impossible. Emergencies become crises. Debt feels inevitable instead of optional. That pressure compounds over time, not just financially, but psychologically. People stop thinking long-term. They stop trusting the future. They stop believing effort leads somewhere meaningful. And that's where underpayment does its quietest damage. It doesn't just limit what you can buy, it limits what you can imagine. When your income barely covers survival, freedom feels abstract, risk feels irresponsible, change feels dangerous, and stability becomes something you chase instead of something you build. That isn't because people lack ambition, it's because the margin for error disappeared. Previous generations had slack in the system, room to recover, room to experiment, room to make mistakes without permanent damage. Many people today don't. And when the system removes slack, it also removes dignity. Because every decision becomes high stakes, and every setback feels like proof you weren't good enough to begin with. But that interpretation is wrong. You're not bad with money. You're operating inside a structure that quietly reduced your share and told you to adapt. And most people don't realize that until they're already exhausted. One of the most effective ways underpayment survives is silence. People are taught very early that talking about money is uncomfortable. Talking about salaries is rude. Comparing pay is inappropriate. Asking for more is risky. And questioning the system is naive. So everyone negotiates alone. When you don't know what others earn, you assume your situation is unique. You assume your struggles are personal. You don't see patterns because the data is fragmented across millions of isolated experiences. That isolation protects the system. If workers compared notes openly, something would become obvious very quickly. Effort is not the problem. The system depends on people believing wages are the natural outcome of neutral forces. That pay is simply what the market decides. That if you're underpaid, it must be because your skills aren't rare enough, your value isn't high enough, or your leverage isn't strong enough. But markets aren't neutral. They reflect power. When housing, healthcare, education, and transportation become unavoidable expenses, wages stop being about value and start being about tolerance. Not how much your work is worth, but how little you can survive on without leaving. That's not a bug. It's a feature. Underpayment works best when it's normalized, when people compare themselves downward instead of upward, when they're told to be grateful instead of compensated, when stability is framed as a privilege instead of a baseline. This is why productivity gains didn't translate into higher wages. They translated into higher expectations. Do more with less. Be available longer. Be flexible. Be grateful you have a job at all. And when technology increased output, it didn't free people, it increased pressure. Faster responses, shorter deadlines, constant availability, more monitoring, more metrics, more ways to extract value without increasing pay. The system learned that it could squeeze time instead of raising wages. And over time, that squeeze became invisible. People stopped remembering what work used to feel like. They accepted exhaustion as normal, burnout as adulthood, stress as responsibility. This is where the emotional damage sets in. When people are underpaid long enough, they stop believing in progress. They don't expect raises to change anything. They don't trust that saving will lead to security. They don't believe hard work creates freedom. They work because they have to, not because they expect a future. That mindset isn't laziness, it's learned realism. And it's incredibly useful to a system that needs people to keep showing up without asking for more. Because a workforce that believes it's failing will work harder than one that knows it's being shortchanged. Debt fills the gap. Underpayment creates. Credit cards. Buy now, pay later. Financing everything from phones to furniture. Debt becomes the bridge between stagnant wages and rising costs. And once debt enters the picture, underpayment becomes even harder to challenge. You can't afford risk when you're leveraged. You can't negotiate when missing a paycheck could ruin you. You can't walk away when your survival depends on staying put. That's not accidental either. Underpayment and debt reinforce each other. Low wages push people toward borrowing. Borrowing increases dependency. Dependency reduces bargaining power. Reduced bargaining power keeps wages low. It's a closed loop. And because the system frames debt as a personal choice, the shame sticks to the individual. People feel irresponsible for needing credit, even when the math makes survival without it unrealistic. They don't say, I'm underpaid. They say, I should be better with money. That shift matters because shame keeps people quiet, and quiet systems don't change. Another reason underpayment persists is because people are told it's temporary, that it's just a phase, that if they endure long enough, things will eventually improve. But for many, the improvement never comes. The raises barely match inflation. Promotions add responsibility without meaningful financial relief, and each year of waiting makes leaving riskier. So people stay, they adjust, they internalize the idea that this is adulthood now. This is why conversations about money often feel emotionally charged. People aren't just talking about numbers, they're talking about dignity, about effort, about whether their time actually matters. When someone finally realizes they're underpaid by design, the first emotion is often relief. Not excitement, relief. Because it explains years of quiet frustration that never had a clear cause. The second emotion is anger, not the loud kind, the focused kind. The kind that comes from realizing you were told to blame yourself for something structural. That anger isn't destructive, it's clarifying. It helps people separate personal responsibility from systemic pressure. It helps them see that struggling doesn't automatically mean failing, and it creates the space to ask better questions. Why does full-time work no longer guarantee stability? Why does productivity rise while pay stagnates? Why are essential costs allowed to outrun wages indefinitely? Those questions don't have simple answers, but they have real ones. And they start where silence ends. You're not bad with money, you're responding rationally to an irrational setup. And once you understand that, the story you tell yourself changes. Not into entitlement, into clarity. Clarity about what's actually happening. Clarity about where pressure comes from. Clarity about what's within your control and what never was. And that clarity is where things finally start to shift. Understanding that you're underpaid by design doesn't magically solve your problems. It doesn't erase bills, it doesn't cancel debt, and it doesn't suddenly make the system fair. But it does something just as important. It changes where you place the blame. When people believe they're bad with money, they keep trying to fix themselves. They optimize endlessly. They sacrifice more. They push harder. They accept stress as proof of responsibility. And when that still isn't enough, they assume the failure is internal. But when you realize the pressure is structural, something shifts. You stop treating exhaustion as a personal flaw. You stop interpreting survival as incompetence. You stop confusing constant effort with progress. That doesn't make you passive. It makes you accurate. Accuracy matters because it determines how you respond. People who misdiagnose the problem waste years trying to fix the wrong thing. People who see the structure clearly stop expecting individual discipline to solve systemic imbalance. This is why awareness alone is powerful. Not because it fixes everything, but because it prevents you from fighting yourself. Once you understand underpayment, you start to notice how often you are asked to compensate for it quietly. How often flexibility meant giving more without receiving more. How often loyalty was rewarded with stagnation. How often gratitude was used to justify imbalance. You also start to notice how carefully the system avoids direct conversations about pay. How transparency is discouraged. How comparison is framed as toxic. How silence is treated as professionalism. That silence benefits one side far more than the other. Breaking it doesn't require outrage. It requires honesty. With yourself first. About what your time is actually worth. About what you're trading away. About how much of your life is being spent maintaining a system that doesn't fully reciprocate. This is where many people get uncomfortable because awareness forces choice. Not dramatic choices, subtle ones. You become more selective. You become less apologetic about boundaries. You become less willing to absorb pressure that was never meant to be yours. You stop treating burnout as a badge of honor. You stop assuming sacrifice is always virtuous. You stop believing that enduring more automatically leads to earning more. That doesn't mean quitting everything or rejecting work. It means refusing to confuse exploitation with normalcy. Underpayment thrives on the idea that there is no alternative, that this is simply how the world works now, that everyone else is managing and you're just barely keeping up. But most people aren't managing. They're coping, quietly, individually, without language for what's happening to them. That isolation is intentional. When struggles are individualized, solutions are individualized too. Budget better, hustle more, meditate through stress, optimize sleep, optimize spending, optimize yourself. But optimization has limits, and people are hitting them. This is why the conversation around money feels different now. Heavier, more emotional, less abstract. People aren't just talking about numbers anymore. They're talking about whether effort still means anything, whether stability is still possible, whether the future feels worth planning for. Those questions aren't radical. They're rational, and they deserve honest answers, not motivational slogans. You don't need permission to notice that something feels off. You don't need credentials to recognize imbalance. And you don't need to feel guilty for wanting a life where work leads somewhere other than survival. You're not bad with money. You're navigating a system that quietly reduced your share and told you to adapt. Seeing that clearly doesn't make you entitled. It makes you informed. And informed people behave differently. They ask different questions. They set different limits. They stop internalizing pressure that was never meant to be personal. That's how change starts. Not with panic, not with collapse, but with clarity spreading slowly, person by person. If any part of this felt uncomfortably familiar, say something in the comments. Not to complain, not to argue, just to acknowledge it out loud, because silence is what keeps this working. And the moment people stop blaming themselves for structural problems, the system loses one of its most reliable tools.